Morning fog enveloped Ketchikan Harbor as I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of tea. The salty air, saturated with the smell of seaweed and fish, always reminded me of Hank. 7 years had passed since he was gone. 7 long years during which I came out here every morning to this porch and looked out at the bay where his boat, the Sea Wolf, used to be moored. My name is Beatrice Knightley. I am 73 years old and the widow of a fishing boat captain who plied the cold waters of Alaska for nearly 4 decades. Our home was always filled with the smell of smoked salmon that Hank brought straight from the boat. Now those smells have been replaced by the scent of my daughter-in-law Imogen's fancy candles and the chemical stench of the air freshener she sprays every morning, as if trying to erase the last memories of Hank from these walls. Good morning, Beatrice. Imogen's voice sounded unexpectedly behind me, making me jump. She never called me Mom or even Mrs. Knightley, just Beatrice, as if we were friends of the same age, not daughter-in-law and mother-in-law with an age difference of almost 40 years. Good morning, I replied without turning around. The small joys of solitude in the morning were rare, and I tried to prolong them as long as possible. You haven't forgotten that Temple is coming today, have you? She's bringing samples of new curtains for the living room. I turned slowly toward her, trying to hide my surprise. Curtains? But we just put up new ones last year. Imogen sighed heavily, as if explaining something to a slow-witted child. Beatrice, those curtains are out of style. Besides, Temple says that Sea Wave is considered provincial this season, and since we often have guests from the cruise company, she didn't finish her sentence, but the meaning was clear. My sister-in-law worked as a customer relations manager for a large cruise line and believed that our, or rather my home, should reflect her status. Imogen, I tried to speak calmly. Hank chose these curtains shortly before he died. They remind me of him. She twisted her lips into a fake smile. Oh, Beatrice, I understand your feelings, but life goes on. Hugh says the same thing. We need to move forward, not live in a museum of memories. I said nothing, taking a sip of cold tea. When Imogen left, I stood on the porch for a while, watching the boats bobbing in the harbor. Yes, life went on, but sometimes it seemed that my own life had stopped the day the Seawolf didn't return to port. After Hank's death, I didn't know what to do with our big house on the hill overlooking the harbor. It was too spacious and lonely for me alone. So when Hugh suggested that Imogen and their son Oliver move in with us, I agreed. The house was filled with life, but it wasn't the life I had imagined. Everything went well for the first few months. Oliver was 14 at the time, and we spent a lot of time together. I told him stories about his grandfather and his adventures at sea, and taught him how to make real fish soup using an old recipe. Hugh was busy with his job as a bailiff, but on weekends we would sometimes go fishing together, or just walk along the coast. Imogen kept her distance from the very beginning. She didn't like anything. The arrangement of the furniture, the color of the walls, or the old photos of Hank on the mantelpiece. Gradually, she began to change the house without asking my opinion. At first, it was small things: new cushions on the sofa, different curtains in the kitchen. Then she removed the collection of ship's knots that Hank and I had collected over the years, saying that they were gathering dust. I only objected once when she wanted to take down a photo of Hank in his captain's uniform that hung in the hallway. This is my house, Imogen, I said at the time, and that photo is staying where it is. Actually, Beatrice, this is our house, she replied coldly. And yes, technically you pay the mortgage, but Hugh and I contribute to the family budget. And this gloomy portrait creates a depressing mood for our guests. That day, the photo remained in place, but a week later I found it in a box in the attic where Imogen stored outdated things. An abstract painting in pastel colors appeared on the wall. After that incident, our relationship was completely ruined. Hugh always took his wife's side, and I increasingly felt like a stranger in my own home. Oliver grew up and went to college in Seattle, coming home only for vacations. Without him there, the house became even colder and more uncomfortable. The neighbors noticed the changes. Phyllis Lamb, who ran a bookstore in the city center and had been my friend since the days when our husbands sailed together, asked me one day, "Bea, are you okay? You seem depressed lately." We were sitting in her shop in a small corner where she usually served tea to her regular customers. Outside the window, it was drizzling, typical for Ketchikan. A city where clear days can be counted on one hand. Everything's fine, Phyllis, I lied, stirring my tea. It's just my age catching up with me. She looked at me doubtfully. Age has nothing to do with it. I saw you climbing the stairs to the post office last week. You're 73, but you're in better shape than many 60-year-olds. I smiled weakly. Yes, physically I felt fine. Years of working as an accountant at a fish cannery had taught me discipline. I still did exercises every morning and walked along the waterfront to the Totem Museum and back 3 times a week. It's not about health, I finally admitted. It's just difficult at home. Hugh and his wife? Phyllis asked directly. I nodded, and she sighed understandingly. You know, my sister went through something similar. When her husband died, she invited her daughter and her family to live with her. A year later, they practically drove her out of her own home. It's not like that with me, I objected. It's still my house. I pay the mortgage. And how much is left to pay? About $50,000. Another 2 years, and the house will be completely mine. Phyllis leaned closer. And who is the property registered to? I hesitated. All three of us. Me, Hugh, and Imogen. That's what the lawyer advised to avoid inheritance issues. And who is this lawyer? Phyllis narrowed her eyes. Brian Kingsley. Imogen's cousin? Phyllis raised her eyebrows. Oh, B. I felt my face flush with embarrassment. Yes, Brian was indeed a distant relative of Imogen's, but I hadn't thought it was important. He seemed professional and caring, and explained all the advantages of joint ownership. B, you need to consult an independent lawyer, Phyllis said seriously. And not someone from Ketchikan, but from Juneau or even Seattle. I can give you some contacts. I promised to think about it, but deep down, I knew I was unlikely to take such a step. Hugh was my only son. Despite all the difficulties, I didn't want to create even more problems in our family. When I returned home after meeting with Phyllis, I found that Imogen had already chosen new curtains, dark blue with some kind of fashionable pattern. They hung in the living room, completely changing the character of the room. The sea green curtains, Hank's last gift, were gone. Do you like them? Imogen asked, noticing my confusion. They're called Midnight Breeze, the latest trend in coastal home design. Where are the old ones? Was all I could ask. Oh, I donated them to a charity shop. Someone will surely find a use for them. I felt a tightness inside, not out of pity for the curtains. After all, they were just fabric. But from the realization of how easily Imogen got rid of things that were valuable to me, without even bothering to ask my opinion. That evening, when Hugh came home from work, I tried to talk to him. Hugh, I think we need to discuss some rules for living together. My son looked at me wearily as he loosened his tie. Mom, not now. I've had a hard day. I understand, but Imogen today, without my consent. The curtains? He interrupted. Yes, she showed me a photo. They look great, much more modern than those old rags. They weren't just rags. I felt my voice tremble. Your father chose them. Hugh rolled his eyes, a gesture he had undoubtedly picked up from his wife. Mom, Dad's been gone for 7 years. You can't live forever in his memory. It's not healthy. It's not a tomb, I replied quietly. It's memories. Memories should be here. He tapped his temple. Not in things. Imogen just wants our house to look respectable, especially when her colleagues and bosses come over. Our house, I repeated. You keep saying our house, but you seem to forget that I'm the one paying for it. Hugh's face darkened. You never miss an opportunity to remind me of that, do you? Imogen and I contribute to the family budget. We buy groceries, pay the utilities, and insure the car. And by the way, if it weren't for us, you'd have to live alone in this huge house or move into a nursing home. Those words hit harder than he could have imagined. I was really afraid of being alone after Hank died. I was afraid of being unwanted, forgotten. That's why I agreed to live with my son and his family. And now he was using that against me. I'm sorry, Mom. Hugh softened, noticing the look on my face. I didn't mean to hurt you. Just understand that times are changing. It's important to Imogen that the house reflects our position in society. She may be promoted to senior manager this year, and will have to entertain more often. I didn't answer, just nodded and went to my room. The only place in the house where Imogen hadn't yet managed to impose her order. There, looking at the photo of Hank on the bedside table, I seriously wondered for the first time, what if Phyllis was right? What if I really should consult an independent lawyer about my rights to the house? That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. Outside the window, the rain was pounding on the roof, reminding me of the times when Hank and I lay in this very room, listening to the music of the storm and planning our future. Back then, we dreamed of growing old together in this house, of our grandchildren coming to visit, of sitting on the porch watching the sunset over the bay. The reality turned out to be very different. Lying there in the dark, I realized it was time for a change. A week had passed since the incident with the curtains. I tried to forget about it, but every time I walked into the living room and saw the dark blue midnight breeze, I felt a twinge in my heart. Imogen didn't seem to notice my mood. She continued to remodel the house, considering it her territory. Hugh fully supported his wife, and I increasingly felt like I was in the way. On Thursday, when the sky over Ketchikan cleared for the first time in many days, I decided to walk to the city center. I needed to buy yarn for the new sweater I was knitting for Oliver for Christmas. Although there was still plenty of time before the holidays, I liked to start early. Knitting was calming and made me feel useful. Walking down the street toward downtown, I ran into Rose Pemberley, a neighbor who lived 2 houses down from us and worked as a medical registrar at the local clinic. "Beatrice, how nice to see you," she exclaimed. "I was just planning to drop by next week. We're organizing a Silver Crafters group for women over 55. We'll meet once a week at the community center to knit, sew, and socialize. You're a craftswoman. I remember your work at last year's fair." The idea appealed to me. The opportunity to get out of the house regularly and socialize with people my own age was just what I needed. "Thank you, Rose. That sounds wonderful. When is the first meeting?" "Next Wednesday at 2 o'clock. Don't be late. There will be tea and homemade cookies from Dorothy Bishop," she winked. We parted ways and I continued on my way, feeling a little better. The thought of new acquaintances and an activity I loved lifted my spirits. I spent almost an hour in the yarn and needle shop, choosing the right colors for the sweater. Leaving with 2 large bags, I decided to stop by the Seabreeze Cafe for a cup of tea before heading home. I took a table by the window, placed my order, and took out my phone to check my messages. Oliver sometimes wrote to me from college, and these rare messages from my grandson were a real treasure. But today, there were no new messages. I had almost finished my tea when the cafe door opened and Imogen and her friend came in. They didn't notice me. My table was in the corner, partially hidden by a decorative partition. The women sat down nearby, continuing their conversation. "So we're planning to completely renovate the kitchen for next season," Imogen said. "Those old cabinets and countertops look so provincial." Her friend Veronica Pierce, who worked with her at the cruise line, nodded sympathetically. "Doesn't your mother-in-law mind? It is her house, after all." Imogen let out a short laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "Beatrice? Oh, she hardly notices what's going on around her anymore. She lives in the past, with all those memories of her captain husband. Hugh says she's becoming more and more absent-minded." I froze with the cup in my hand. Absent-minded? Me? I remembered all my neighbors' birthdays and could name the exact date of every significant event in our family's life. "It often happens at that age," Veronica said sympathetically. "My aunt also started to decline after she turned 70. In the end, we found an excellent retirement home where she is well cared for." "That's what I'm telling Hugh, that it's time to think about something like that." Imogen lowered her voice, but I could still hear every word. "Sunny Heights recently opened a new wing with single rooms and a view of the bay. Beatrice would be much more comfortable there." "And she agrees?" "We haven't discussed it with her directly yet. Hugh thinks we should wait until Christmas when Oliver comes home. He's Grandma's favorite. She'll listen to him better." I felt the blood drain from my face. They were planning to send me to a nursing home, and they were going to use my grandson to convince me. And I thought I was just inviting my son and his family to live with us. "What about the house?" Veronica asked. "She's not going to sell it, is she?" "No, of course not." Imogen lowered her voice even more. "The house is in all 3 of their names. When well, it will pass to us entirely. In the meantime, we're just gradually making it more modern and presentable. Next year, when I become senior manager, we'll need a decent place to entertain guests." I couldn't listen any longer. Quietly leaving the money on the table, I slipped out of the cafe, trying not to catch their eye. With trembling hands, I picked up the bags of yarn and quickly walked up the street, away from the harbor, away from those awful words. They wanted to get rid of me, evict me from my own home, the home that Hank and I had bought 40 years ago, paying off the mortgage for many years. A house where every floorboard, every crack in the ceiling was familiar and dear to me. When well, Imogen couldn't even say the word dies when talking about me, but she had already planned how she would dispose of my house after my death. Overcome with anger and hurt, I walked to the end of the street and stopped, catching my breath. What should I do? Who should I tell? Phyllis was away visiting her daughter in Portland. I didn't dare confide in anyone else. It was a small town, and rumors spread quickly. The last thing I needed was for Hugh and Imogen to find out that I had overheard their plans. I slowly wandered home, trying to calm down and collect my thoughts. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe Imogen was just bragging to her friend and there was no nursing home involved. But deep down, I knew she wasn't joking, and Hugh was in on it. When I got home, I found that my son had come home from work earlier than usual. He was sitting in the living room with a man I didn't know. Catalogs and samples of materials were spread out on the coffee table. "Oh, Mom." Hugh looked slightly surprised to see me. "Meet Arthur Stone, an interior designer. He's going to help us renovate the kitchen." "Renovating the kitchen?" I asked, trying to sound calm, even though I was boiling inside. "I don't remember us discussing this." "Well, Imogen and I have been talking about the need for modernization for a long time," Hugh shrugged. "Arthur just finished a project for Veronica, and the result is simply stunning. So, Veronica." Everything fell into place. My friend recommended a designer, and now he's here, ready to remodel my kitchen, where every cabinet and every shelf remembered Hank's touch. "Mrs. Knightley," Arthur addressed me with a professional smile, "you have a beautiful home with tremendous potential, but I must admit, the kitchen looks outdated. We could turn it into a real work of art while preserving the spirit of the sea, which is so important in Ketchikan." "The spirit of the sea," I echoed. "Yes, it's important." "Arthur suggests replacing the wooden cabinets with modern glossy ones," Hugh continued enthusiastically, "and installing an island in the middle, with a wine refrigerator and an additional sink." I listened silently as they discussed my kitchen, as if I were invisible. The kitchen where I cooked fish dinners for Hank after he returned from sailing. Where I taught little Hugh to bake chocolate chip cookies. Where Oliver loved to sit on the windowsill watching the ships in the harbor while I cooked his favorite blueberry pancakes. "I need time to think about this," I finally said, trying to sound firm. "And I'd like to know the approximate cost of such a renovation." "Oh, don't worry about the money, Mom." Hugh waved it off. "Imogen and I will cover part of the expenses." "Part?" I raised an eyebrow. "What about the rest?" An awkward pause ensued. Arthur shifted his gaze from me to Hugh and back again, clearly feeling uncomfortable. "I think I'll leave you to discuss the details," he said, gathering up the catalogs. "Mrs. Knightley, it was a pleasure to meet you. Hugh, I'll call you tomorrow." When the designer left, my son sighed. "Mom, why are you doing this?" "We just want to improve the house." "Improve it for whom?" I asked bluntly. "This kitchen is perfect for me. It's full of memories of your father, of you, of our family." "Memories again," Hugh waved his hand irritably. "We can't live in a museum, Mom. Times are changing. It's important to Imogen that the house matches her status in the company. And it's important to me that my house remains my house," I said firmly. "I didn't agree to these changes, and I'm not going to pay for them." Hugh's face darkened. "You always know how to ruin the mood." "It's no surprise that Imogen sometimes says—" He cut himself off, but it was too late. "What does Imogen say?" I asked quietly, even though I already knew the answer from overhearing their conversation. "Nothing," Hugh muttered. "Forget it." The atmosphere at dinner that evening was tense. Imogen studiously avoided looking me in the eye, and Hugh was silent, staring at his plate. I wasn't eager to talk either, replaying the overheard conversation in my head and thinking about what to do next. "The Peers are coming to visit on Saturday." Imogen finally broke the silence. "We'll discuss our summer vacation together. We're thinking of renting a house on Lake Tahoe." "Veronica and James?" I asked innocently, watching my sister-in-law's reaction closely. Imogen flinched when she heard her friend's name. Yes, they... How did you know? You mentioned it yesterday, I lied, when you were discussing your plans for the weekend. Oh, yes, she said, nervously adjusting her napkin. Anyway, it's nothing special, just sitting around, drinking wine, chatting. Of course, I smiled. It's our shared home, isn't it? On Wednesday, I went to my first meeting of the Silver Needle Workers. There were about 15 women of different ages, ranging from 55 to over 80. Rose introduced me, and I was warmly welcomed. We knitted, chatted, shared news and recipes. For a few hours, I forgot about my problems and felt part of a community where I was valued and respected. But when I returned home, I was plunged back into an atmosphere of alienation. Imogen and Hugh were discussing the details of the upcoming kitchen renovation without even asking my opinion. When I tried to intervene, they politely but firmly made it clear that the decision had already been made. Arthur has already ordered the materials, Mom, Hugh said. It will be ready in a month. You'll like it, I promise. I didn't respond, but at that moment I knew I had to take action. On Thursday, I called Phyllis, even though she was still in Portland. "B, what's wrong?" she asked when she heard my voice. "You sound upset." I told her about the conversation I had overheard, about Imogen and Hugh's plans to send me to a nursing home, about how they had already started remodeling the house for themselves. I knew it, Phyllis sighed. I didn't trust that couple from the start, especially your daughter-in-law. What are you going to do? I don't know, I admitted honestly. I don't want to fight with my son, but I can't let them treat me like a burden either. You need legal advice, B, Phyllis said firmly. And not from Imogen's cousin. I have a lawyer friend in Juneau, Lawrence Montgomery. He specializes in cases like this, defending the rights of the elderly, housing issues. I'll give you his number. Do you think it will come to that? Lawyers? I asked bitterly. I hope not, Phyllis softened. But it's better to know your rights. Talk to him, it won't cost you anything. The first consultation is free. I wrote down Lawrence Montgomery's number and thanked my friend. The next day, under the pretext of a doctor's appointment, I went to Juneau, to the office of the law firm Montgomery and Partners. Lawrence Montgomery, a gray-haired man about my age, listened attentively to my story, occasionally making notes in his notebook. So, Mrs. Knightley, he said when I finished my story, let's clarify the situation. The house formally belongs to you, your son, and his wife. You continue to pay the mortgage and remain the primary payer. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. And you're concerned that they might force you to leave the house against your will? Exactly, I said, clutching my purse. They're already talking about a nursing home. But I'm only 73. I'm of sound mind and memory. I have no doubt about that, the lawyer smiled gently. Tell me, do you have a will? Yes, one drawn up while Hank was still alive. All our property goes to Hugh. And it hasn't been revised since you registered joint ownership of the house? No. I shook my head. Brian Kingsley, the lawyer from Ketchikan who handled the paperwork for the house, said it wasn't necessary. Lawrence frowned slightly. Brian Kingsley, he's related to your daughter-in-law, if I'm not mistaken? Yes, he's her cousin. But I didn't think it was important at the time. I see. He made another note. Mrs. Knightley, the situation is not hopeless, but it requires a serious approach. First, you should review the will. Second, you need to carefully examine the documents for the house. Third, you should consider setting up a trust to protect your assets. He spoke at length, explaining legal terms in simple language and discussing possible strategies for protecting my rights. I listened attentively, feeling hope arise for the first time in a long time. What would you advise me to do right now? I asked when he finished. Bring all the documents for the house and your current will for a detailed review, Lawrence replied, and don't tell anyone about our meeting, especially Brian Kingsley. I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of fear and determination. I was about to fight for my house, for my independence, for my dignity. A fight against my own son. A week passed after my visit to the lawyer. I quietly gathered all the documents for the house and took them to Lawrence Montgomery, who studied them carefully. It turned out that the situation was even worse than I had imagined. Brian Kingsley, Imogen's cousin, had drawn up the contract so that upon my death, the house would pass entirely to Hugh and his wife, even though most of the mortgage payments were made from my account. It's not entirely legal, Lawrence said, taking off his glasses and rubbing his nose wearily, but it will take a long time to contest. Fortunately, there is another way. He suggested that I pay off the remaining mortgage from my savings and then, as a co-owner, initiate the sale of the house. By law, even if one of the co-owners objects to the sale, the court usually sides with the person who wants to divide the property. I thought about this plan for several days. On the one hand, it hurt to think about selling the house where I had spent a significant part of my life, where every corner reminded me of Hank. On the other hand, I knew that Hugh and Imogen would not give up trying to outlive me. The tension in the house was only growing. The kitchen renovation began without my consent. One day, I simply came home and found workers removing the old cabinets that Hank had once installed himself. On Saturday evening, Imogen decided to host a family dinner. Such a sudden display of family spirit was alarming, but I agreed. Perhaps they wanted to mend their relationship. I was tense all day, sensing that this dinner was not just a simple reconciliation. My intuition did not fail me. When we sat down at the table, the atmosphere seemed tense. Beatrice, Imogen began, serving herself some salad, Hugh and I wanted to talk to you about our situation. I nodded silently, continuing to eat my soup. My sister-in-law exchanged glances with my son, as if seeking support. The thing is, we've run into some financial difficulties, she continued. The kitchen renovation cost more than we planned, and there are a number of other expenses. Get to the point, Imogen, I said calmly. What exactly are you trying to tell me? She put down her fork, her eyes narrowing. You're not contributing enough to the family budget, she snapped. I almost choked on my soup. Excuse me? You heard me. Imogen stared at me intently. Hugh and I are paying for most of the running costs. Food, utilities, repairs. Yes, you pay the mortgage, but that's not enough. Not enough? I couldn't believe my ears. I pay $2,000 a month on the mortgage for the house where you live practically for free. I buy the groceries, cook, clean. Don't exaggerate, Imogen snorted. I do most of the cooking and we take turns cleaning. As for the mortgage, the house is in all of our names, so it's our shared responsibility. Which, for some reason, I bear most of, I remarked, feeling a wave of anger rising inside me. Mom, Hugh interjected, we appreciate your contribution, but right now we need extra help. Imogen's right, expenses have gone up and we can't keep up. What about your bailiff's salary and Imogen's income from the cruise line? I asked. As far as I remember, you both earn good money. We have our own expenses, Hugh replied, looking away. Loan payments, the car, and a new vacation at Lake Tahoe. I couldn't hold back the sarcasm. And the kitchen renovation that no one discussed with me? See? Imogen turned to Hugh. I told you she wouldn't understand. What exactly am I supposed to understand? I put my spoon down on the table. That you want me to pay more for the house you consider yours? For the changes you're making without my consent? We're asking you to be part of the family. Hugh raised his voice. To share responsibility. Part of the family? I smiled bitterly. How am I part of the family if you don't ask my opinion about anything? Enough. Hugh slammed his hand on the table. The point is, Mom, we need your help. Another $500 a month for shared expenses. It's not that much considering your pension and savings. What if I refuse? Hugh and Imogen exchanged glances. Then my son looked me straight in the eye and said, Then you'll have to find another place to live. Either you help out more, or you move out. Silence hung in the dining room. I looked at my son, whom I had raised alone after Hank's death, whom I loved more than life itself, and I didn't recognize him. Before me was a stranger with Hugh's face, his voice, but a completely different soul. I slowly got up from the table, still not believing what I had heard. I understand, I said quietly. Thank you for your honesty. And I left the dining room, leaving them sitting there with their mouths open. They were probably expecting tears, pleas, promises, anything but such calm acceptance of the ultimatum. In my room, I quickly gathered the necessary documents, grabbed my purse, and went downstairs. Hugh and Imogen were still in the dining room, their muffled voices sounding agitated. "I'm leaving," I said as I passed through the doorway. "I'll be back later." "Mom, wait!" Hugh jumped up, but I was already closing the front door behind me. The rain, typical of Ketchikan, was drizzling, turning the streets into wet mirrors. I walked to the bus stop and took the first bus to Juneau. I looked out the window the whole way but saw neither mountains, nor the bay, nor forests. All I could see was Hugh's face as he uttered those terrible words, "Get out of the house." I was seen immediately at Lawrence Montgomery's office. Seeing my state, the lawyer took out the prepared documents without asking any questions. "Are you sure, Mrs. Knightley?" he asked when I picked up the pen. "This is a serious step." "Absolutely sure," I replied firmly. "Where do I sign?" Over the next hour, I signed all the necessary papers: a power of attorney for Lawrence to represent my interests, an order to transfer money from my savings account to pay off the mortgage in full, and a statement of intent to sell the house as a co-owner. "That's it," Lawrence said, gathering the documents. "The bank will receive the money today. Tomorrow we will send a notice to your son and his wife about the full repayment of the mortgage and the listing of the house for sale. By law, they cannot prevent the sale, although they will certainly try." "What should I do now?" I asked, suddenly feeling uncertain. "Go home and wait for their reaction," replied the lawyer. "They will be in shock and may try to pressure you emotionally. Don't give in. Remember that legally you are in a stronger position. I will be available at any time." Returning to Ketchikan, I felt a strange calm. It was as if a huge weight that had been pressing on my shoulders all these months had finally disappeared. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew for sure that I would no longer tolerate neglect and humiliation in my own home. When I returned, it was already dusk. The lights were on in the windows and Hugh's car was in the driveway. I took a deep breath and entered the house. They were waiting for me in the living room. Hugh was pacing the room, and Imogen was sitting on the sofa, nervously fiddling with the bracelet on her wrist. "Mom, where have you been? We were worried." "Really?" I calmly took off my coat. "I thought you'd be glad if I left the house." "Mom, that's not what I meant." Hugh looked guilty. "Imogen and I got carried away. Of course we don't want you to leave. We just thought you could contribute more," Imogen added without getting up from the sofa. "Considering that this is your home too." "You're right." I sat down in the armchair opposite them. "This is my home too, and today I contributed." "What do you mean?" Hugh frowned. "I paid off the mortgage in full," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "All 52,000 that was left." Their faces reflected amazement, which turned to joy. "Mom, that's amazing!" Hugh exclaimed. "So the house is all ours now." "Not quite." I allowed myself a slight smile. "I've also filed to sell the house." "What?" They both froze. "You can't do that," Imogen was the first to recover. "The house belongs to all three of us." "That's exactly why I can do it," I replied. "As a co-owner, I have the right to initiate the sale. My lawyer is already working on it." "A lawyer?" Hugh turned pale. "You hired a lawyer?" "Yes, Lawrence Montgomery from Juneau. He's a very competent professional." "But why?" Hugh sat down on the sofa next to his wife. "We're a family. Why do we need lawyers?" "Good question," I nodded. "Tell me, son, when does a family start giving ultimatums to its members? When does a mother have to pay for the right to live in her own home?" "That's not what we meant," Hugh muttered, but his eyes darted around, betraying his lie. "I think that's exactly what we meant," I replied. "And you know what? I'm actually grateful to you. You made me realize that I deserve better. I deserve respect and dignity. And I will get them, even if it means starting a new life at 73. Hugh and Imogen sat in shock, trying to comprehend my words, and I, feeling an unprecedented lightness, got up from my chair and headed for the stairs. "The house will be put up for sale within a week," I said, turning around. "I advise you to start looking for a new place to live." The next morning was surprisingly sunny for Ketchikan. Rays of light streamed through the curtains, painting golden paths across the floor of my bedroom. I lay with my eyes open, listening to the sounds of the house. It was quiet downstairs, although Imogen was usually already clattering around in the kitchen at this time, preparing her trendy smoothies before work. Last night had ended in an uncomfortable silence. After my announcement about selling the house, Hugh and Imogen had no response. I went up to my room, and they remained in the living room, talking quietly. Several times I heard Imogen's voice rise, but I couldn't make out the words. I slowly got up, got dressed, and went downstairs. There was no one in the kitchen, but there was a note on the refrigerator in Hugh's bold handwriting. Mom, we need to have a serious talk. We'll do it tonight. Please, no rash decisions. Rash? I smiled bitterly. My decision was the result of long deliberation and sleepless nights. I knew exactly what I was doing. The day passed in a strange calm. I had breakfast, tidied up the house, and after lunch decided to call Phyllis, who had just returned from Portland. "Bee!" she exclaimed when she heard my voice. "I just got back yesterday. How are you? Have you talked to Lawrence?" "Not just talked," I replied, lowering my voice even though no one else was in the house. "I signed all the papers. The house will be put up for sale next week." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Oh, Bee," Phyllis finally said, "so it's come to this. I'm sorry." "I'm not," I said, surprised at the firmness of my own voice. "Yesterday they crossed the line. They said I wasn't contributing enough to the family budget and that I had to either pay more or move out." "What?" Phyllis was outraged. "How could they, after everything you've done for them?" We talked for almost an hour. I told my friend all the details. How Imogen planned to send me to a nursing home, how they renovated the kitchen without my consent, and how they considered the house theirs, even though I paid most of the mortgage. "What are you going to do now?" Phyllis asked. "Will you stay with them until the house is sold?" I sighed. "I don't know. On the one hand, legally, I have every right to live here. On the other hand, I'm not sure I can take it. The atmosphere will be unbearable." "I have a suggestion," Phyllis said after a pause. "Remember the apartment above my store? I used to rent it out, but the last tenant moved out 2 months ago. It's small but cozy, and it has a view of the harbor. Are you suggesting I move in with you?" "Why not? The apartment is empty, and I'd feel better if you weren't staying with those." Phyllis didn't finish her sentence, but I understood what she meant. The offer was tempting. Temporary housing, independence, the opportunity to wait quietly for the house to sell. "I'll think about it," I replied. "Thank you, Phyllis." In the evening, as promised, Hugh and Imogen returned. I was sitting in the living room, leafing through an old photo album when they came in. Their faces showed a determination that seemed feigned to me. "Mom, we need to talk," Hugh began, sitting down in the chair opposite me. Imogen remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest. "Yes, we do," I agreed, closing the album. "We've thought a lot about yesterday," my son continued, "and we want to apologize. What I said was wrong. Of course, this is your house, and no one has the right to kick you out of here. But you shouldn't sell it either," Imogen quickly added. "We can resolve our differences in other ways." I looked at them closely, trying to gauge how sincere their words were. "How?" I asked. "We can review our expenses," Hugh suggested. "Postpone the living room renovation, for example, and take your opinion more into account in decisions about the house." "More?" I couldn't hold back the sarcasm. "Did you ever take it into account before?" "Beatrice." Imogen moved closer, her tone becoming harsher. "You don't understand what you're doing. Selling the house is a last resort. Have you thought about the consequences? Where will you live? What will happen to us?" "I'll find a place to live," I replied calmly. "And you will too. You're young, you have jobs, you'll manage." "Mom." Hugh looked concerned. "What if we go to court? Challenge your right to sell the house without our consent?" There it was. They had gone from apologies to threats. "You can try," I shrugged. "But my lawyer is confident that the law is on my side. The court almost always sides with the co-owner who wants to divide the property. Especially if that co-owner has just paid off the entire mortgage with their savings." Hugh and Imogen exchanged glances. I saw fear flash in their eyes. "It will take a long time," Hugh said. "Months of court proceedings, nerves, money." "I have time," I replied. "And I've already spent my nerves and money living with you these past few years." Imogen suddenly changed tactics. Her face softened. Her voice became almost ingratiating. "Beatrice, we're family. We have arguments, misunderstandings, but in the end, we always find common ground. Let's just forget yesterday's conversation and start with a clean slate. I can't forget yesterday's conversation. I shook my head. Or a lot of other things. The curtains you threw away without my knowledge. The photo of Hank you hid in the attic. The plans to send me to sunny fields? What? Imogen turned pale. What are you talking about? I overheard your conversation with Veronica at the cafe, I said, looking her straight in the eye. When you were discussing how to use Oliver to convince me to move into a nursing home. You were spying on me? She exclaimed indignantly. I happened to be at the next table, but that's not the point. You decided long ago that I was a hindrance, that the house should belong to you alone, and yesterday you simply said it out loud. Hugh looked stunned. Imogen, did you really say that? She waved her hand dismissively. It was just a conversation. We were discussing different options, nothing specific. Specific enough to plan to use my grandson, I countered. A heavy silence hung in the room. Finally, Hugh got up from his chair. Mom, let's give ourselves some time to cool down. Maybe in a couple of days we can discuss everything calmly and find a compromise. The decision has been made, Hugh, I said firmly. The house will be sold. Everyone will get their share. And we will go our separate ways. You'll regret this, Imogen hissed as she left the room. Perhaps, I replied after her. But right now, my only regret is that I didn't do this sooner. Hugh looked at me with a long gaze that conveyed a mixture of hurt, disappointment, and, it seemed to me, shame. Then he silently followed his wife. The next morning, I called Phyllis and accepted her offer of an apartment. We agreed that I would move in 3 days later, when she would have time to do a little cleaning and prepare the apartment for my arrival. Those 3 days were filled with tension. Hugh and Imogen hardly spoke to me, and when they did, it was only out of necessity. I calmly packed my things, deciding to take only the most necessary and personal items. Clothes, photographs, souvenirs that Hank had given me from his voyages, and my handicrafts. I could leave the furniture behind. Phillips's apartment had everything I needed. On the evening of the second day, as I was putting my sweaters in my suitcase, there was a knock at the bedroom door. Come in, I said without turning around. It was Hugh. He looked tired and haggard. Mom, are you really leaving? Yes, I continued packing. I rented an apartment from Phyllis above her bookstore. But why? It could be months before the house sells. You have every right to stay here. And live in a Cold War atmosphere? I finally looked at him. No, thank you. It will be better for everyone. You're doing this to spite us, aren't you? His voice took on an accusatory tone. To punish us for those words? I sighed and sat down on the edge of the bed. Hugh, I'm not trying to punish anyone. I just want to live with dignity and respect for myself. In recent years, I've felt like a stranger here, an uninvited guest in my own home. And it's not just about what you said yesterday. It's been building up for a long time. What about me? He sat down next to me. I'm your son, your family. Family isn't just about blood ties, I replied quietly. It's also about caring, respect, and attention to each other's feelings. When was the last time you asked me what I wanted? When was the last time you asked my opinion before changing something in the house? He was silent, staring at the floor. I love you, Hugh, I continued. You are my son, and that will never change. But right now, it's better for us to live apart. Maybe with time, our relationship will improve. Imogen thinks you're bluffing, he said suddenly. That you won't decide to sell the house where you lived with Dad for so many years. Imogen doesn't know me very well, I smiled. Yes, this house is full of memories, but they will stay with me wherever I live, and the walls are just walls. Hugh left without saying another word. The next day, I found a thick envelope on the kitchen table. It contained $10,000 in cash and a note. Mom, please accept this as compensation for the kitchen renovation and our share of the expenses. Maybe now we can forget about selling the house? I shook my head. They still didn't understand that it wasn't about the money. I left the envelope on the table and added my own note. This won't solve our problems. The house will be sold. It rained on moving day. Phyllis picked me up in her old station wagon, and the two of us loaded my things. Hugh was at work, and Imogen sat in the living room pretending to be engrossed in a magazine. but I could feel her gaze on me as I walked past with the boxes. "You're making a big mistake," she said as I came downstairs for the last time. "You'll regret this decision." "Maybe," I replied. "But right now, my only regret is that I didn't do it sooner." The apartment above Phyllis's bookstore was small but cozy. One bedroom, a living room combined with a kitchen, and a tiny bathroom. But most importantly, it had a large window overlooking the harbor, almost the same as the view from my former home. "Make yourself at home," Phyllis said, helping me unpack my things. "Feel free to make yourself comfortable. And tonight I'll invite you downstairs for dinner. I'll make my signature salmon pie." "Thank you," I hugged my friend. "I don't know what I would have done without you." When Phyllis left, I slowly walked around the apartment, getting used to the new space. I arranged photos on the shelves, hung clothes in the closet, and put my crafts in the dresser drawers. Then I sat down in the armchair by the window and looked out at the bay for a long time, where fishing boats were bobbing up and down. A strange feeling filled me, a mixture of sadness and relief. I had left a house full of memories, but also years of humiliation and hurt. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. There was a knock at the door. Rose Pemberley was standing on the doorstep. "Phyllis said you moved," she said, handing me a basket of fruit and homemade cookies. "I decided to come by and say hello to my new neighbor. I live a block away." "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "Don't mind the mess. I haven't finished unpacking yet." We sat in chairs by the window, drinking tea and talking about everything under the sun. City news, our craft club, plans for the coming weeks. Rose didn't ask any questions about my move, and I was grateful for her tact. "You know," she said as she was about to leave, "I think you'll be happy here. Downtown, everything is close by, lots of people. And Phyllis is a wonderful hostess. She's been saying for a long time that she'd like someone close to her to live above the store." After Rose left, I went back to the window. The rain had stopped, and a rainbow appeared over the bay. Bright, multicolored, like a symbol of new life. I smiled at my thoughts. Perhaps it's scary to start all over again at 73, but I had savings, friends, and most importantly, a sense of self-worth that I had finally regained. That evening, over dinner at Phyllis's, we discussed my plans for the future. "After you sell the house, you'll have enough money to buy something of your own," said my friend, serving me another piece of pie. "Maybe a small cottage on the outskirts, or an apartment in a new building on Prechalna Street." "I haven't decided yet," I replied. "Maybe I'll even rent a bigger apartment. I don't want to rush into buying something." "What will you do?" Phyllis asked. "You've always been active. You need something to do." I thought about it. Before, my whole life revolved around my home and family. Now I had the opportunity to do something else. "Maybe I'll go back to accounting," I suggested. "Consulting, helping small businesses, or I'll spend more time on handicrafts. You know how much I love to knit. I could sell my creations at fairs." "You could also help me in the store," Phyllis suggested. "A couple of days a week. I've been looking for an assistant for a long time, but I didn't want to hire strangers." The offer seemed tempting. Phyllis's bookstore was a special place. Warm, cozy, with the smell of paper and coffee, which she always offered to her regular customers. "I'll think about it," I nodded. "Thank you for the offer." When I returned to my new apartment, I felt an unusual sense of calm. For the first time in a long time, I could plan for the future without looking back at the needs and desires of other people. I didn't have to adjust to Imogen's mood. I didn't have to worry that my actions would displease Hugh. I sat down at my small desk and began to make a list. What did I want to do in the near future? Reconnect with friends who had drifted away during my years of seclusion in my own home. Take care of my health. I had been putting off a visit to the doctor for a long time. Return to my old hobbies and perhaps find new ones. I remembered that Dorothy Bishop, one of the members of our craft circle, had mentioned computer literacy courses for seniors at the community center. Maybe I should sign up. In today's world, it's difficult without these skills, and I've always loved learning new things. My thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. It was Hugh. "Mom, how are you? Have you settled in?" "Yes, everything's fine," I replied, surprised by his call. "The apartment is small but cozy. Listen, he said quickly, as if afraid I would hang up. I spoke to a lawyer. He said there are ways to contest the sale of the house. Maybe we can sit down and discuss it again? The three of us calmly, without emotion. Hugh, I sighed. The decision has been made. The house will be sold. Everyone will get their share and go their separate ways. But it's our family home. His voice sounded desperate. Where I grew up, where you lived with Dad. It was a home, I said softly. Now it's just real estate that we're selling. It ceased to be a family home the moment you decided I was surplus to requirements. After talking to Hugh, I couldn't sleep for a long time. Despite the firmness of my decision, somewhere deep inside I felt pain. After all, he is my son, my flesh and blood. But I knew I had made the right choice. Sometimes you have to let go of the past to find the future. Before going to bed, I went to the window. The lights of Ketchikan reflected in the dark water of the bay, creating the illusion of a starry sky beneath my feet. I looked at this city, where I had lived most of my life, and felt that only now had I truly become a part of it. Not as someone's wife, mother, or mother-in-law, but as an independent woman, ready to start a new chapter in my story. Selling the house took less time than I expected. Ketchikan is a small town where real estate with a view of the bay has always been highly valued, and our house, located on a hill with a spacious veranda and its own dock, was considered one of the best in the area. Despite Hugh's attempts to drag out the process, Lawrence Montgomery acted quickly and efficiently. A month after listing the house, we had a buyer, a couple from Seattle who had long dreamed of owning a home in Alaska. They offered more than our initial asking price and agreed to all of our terms. The house sold for $850,000. The day we signed the papers was clear and sunny, which is rare for Ketchikan. I arrived at the notary's office ahead of schedule, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Hugh and Imogen showed up at the last minute, both tense and silent. Is everything okay? Lawrence asked when I sat down next to him at the table. Yes, I nodded. It's just a strange feeling. I've lived in this house for almost 40 years. I understand, he said sympathetically, squeezing my hand. But sometimes you have to let go of the past to move on. The signing of the documents went quickly and without complications. Hugh tried to make last-minute changes to the distribution of funds, but Lawrence was adamant. By law, the money had to be divided equally between the co-owners. When all the formalities were completed, we went outside. I was about to say goodbye and leave when Hugh called out to me, "Mom, wait! We need to talk." I stopped, expecting more reproaches or attempts to make me feel guilty, but my son looked more confused than angry. Imogen and we need to move out within 2 weeks. The new owners want to move in as soon as possible. I know, I nodded. Those are the terms of the deal. The thing is, he hesitated, we haven't found a suitable place to live yet. The rental market in Ketchikan is difficult right now. Maybe you could lend you money for the down payment on a new house? I finished for him. Hugh flushed. No, not borrow, just maybe you could talk to Phyllis? She has connections in town. Maybe she knows someone who's renting. I looked closely at my son. He had always been proud, never asking for help. The fact that he was turning to me now showed how serious the situation was. I'll ask her, I finally said. But I can't promise anything. Thanks, he nodded. And another thing, Oliver is coming next week. He doesn't know about the sale of the house in our Discord. I'd like you to tell him yourself. Of course, I agreed. I miss him very much. Imogen stood to one side, watching our conversation with an inscrutable expression. When I turned to leave, she suddenly said, I hope you're happy, Beatrice. You've destroyed our family. I stopped but didn't turn around. No, Imogen. You destroyed the family with your greed and disrespect. I just stopped putting up with it. Back in my small apartment above the bookstore, the first thing I did was call the bank to make sure the money from the sale of the house had been deposited into my account. $283,000, my third of the total. It was more than I expected, but less than it could have been if I had demanded compensation for the years I had paid the mortgage. However, I had no regrets. It was enough for a comfortable life and for what I had in mind. The next day, I met with a financial advisor recommended by Lawrence. We discussed options for disposing of the money at length, and I told him about my decision. I want to set up a trust fund for my grandson Oliver, I said. $100,000 that he can use to pay for college or start his own business after graduation. That's very generous, the advisor remarked. Are you sure you want to allocate such a significant amount? Absolutely sure, I nodded. Oliver is not to blame for the conflict between me and his parents. He has always been kind to me and I want to secure his future. What about your son? The advisor asked cautiously. Don't you want to leave something for him too? I thought about it. Hugh and Imogen had received their share from the sale of the house, and despite everything that had happened, I didn't wish them any harm. No, I finally replied. They're adults. They have jobs and their share of the sale. They'll be fine. But Oliver, he's just starting out in life, and I want him to have a solid start. It took several days to set up the trust fund. I insisted on one important condition. Hugh and Imogen would not have access to this money. It was intended solely for Oliver, and only he could dispose of it after reaching the age of 21. Oliver arrived in Ketchikan on Friday evening. I arranged to meet him on Saturday morning at the Sea Breeze Cafe, the very place where I had once overheard Imogen and Veronica's conversation. He showed up at 10 o'clock sharp, tall and thin, so much like his father in his youth. "Grandma!" he exclaimed when he saw me and gave me a big hug. "I missed you so much." "I missed you too, dear," I said, struggling to hold back my tears. "Sit down and tell me how college is going." We talked for almost an hour about his studies, new friends, and plans for the future. Oliver dreamed of becoming a marine biologist. Perhaps his sailor grandfather's genes were showing. He talked so enthusiastically about his research projects that I didn't dare interrupt him to bring up the unpleasant topic. Finally, when the waitress brought us our second cups of coffee, Oliver brought up the subject himself. "Grandma, what's going on between you and my parents? Dad said you moved out and are living with Phyllis, but he didn't explain why." I took a deep breath. The moment of truth had arrived. "Oliver, dear, it's a long and not very pleasant story. There were differences between me and your parents. We had different visions of our future together. In the end, I decided it would be better for us to live separately. But it's temporary, right?" Concern appeared in his eyes. "Will you make up?" "It's not that simple." I shook my head. "The house has been sold. We each got our share and will now build our own lives." "What?" Oliver looked shocked. "Our house? The one on the hill overlooking the bay?" "Yes, that's the one," I confirmed. "The new owners are moving in 10 days. Your parents are now looking for a new place to live." Oliver was silent, digesting the information. I saw disbelief, shock, and confusion flash across his eyes. "But why?" he finally asked. "What happened?" I thought long and hard about how to explain the situation to him without turning him against my parents, but also without hiding the whole truth. "Your parents wanted me to contribute more money to the family budget," I finally said. "When I refused, they suggested I move out. I decided that in this situation it would be better to sell the house and divide the money." It was an oversimplification, but not a lie. I didn't tell him about the plans to send me to a nursing home, about Imogen's humiliating comments, about how my belongings and memories were ruthlessly thrown away. "I can't believe it," Oliver shook his head. "Dad couldn't have said that?" "I understand that it's hard for you to accept," I said gently. "But sometimes adults make mistakes and say things they later regret. I don't hold it against them, Oliver. And I don't want you to judge them." "Where do you live now?" he asked after a pause. "At Phyllis's above her bookstore. It's a small but cozy apartment. Would you like to see it?" Oliver nodded and we headed to my place. On the way, I told him about my new plans. Helping Phyllis in the store, doing needlework, and possibly providing accounting advice. "I also set up a trust fund for you," I said as we climbed the stairs to my apartment. $100,000 that you can use for your education or to start your own business after college. Oliver stopped halfway up the stairs. "Grandma, you don't have to. I can't accept that kind of money." "You can and you will," I said firmly. "It's my money, and I decide how to spend it. I want you to have a solid start in adult life." There were tears in his eyes when he hugged me. "Thank you, but it's more important to me that you're happy. Will you have enough money to live on?" "More than enough," I smiled. I have enough left to buy a small house or apartment and still live comfortably. Don't worry about me. Over the next few days, the only thing people in town talked about was the sale of the Knightley house. News travels fast in Little Ketchikan, and soon everyone knew that Hugh and Imogen had kicked old Beatrice out of her own house. Of course, that was an oversimplification, but as they say, there's no smoke without fire. Phyllis said that people came into her shop specifically to express their support for me. Dorothy Bishop, one of the members of our craft circle, brought a homemade pie and ranted at length about modern children who don't respect their elders. Even Rose Pemberley, who was usually reserved in her opinions, remarked that some people get what they deserve. I tried not to engage in these conversations and not to judge Hugh and Imogen's behavior. After all, he was still my son, and she was the mother of my grandson. But there was no denying that their reputation in town had been seriously damaged. It was especially hard on Imogen. The cruise line where she worked valued the reputation of its employees, especially those in management positions. Rumors that she had kicked her mother-in-law out of the house did not help her career. The promotion she had been counting on went to Veronica Pierce, the very woman with whom Imogen had discussed plans to send me to a nursing home. Hugh also faced unpleasant consequences. As a bailiff, he often interacted with people, and many now looked at him with disapproval. Once, Phyllis told me that she heard an elderly woman in line at the supermarket say loudly, "There goes the one who kicked his own mother out of the house." I felt sorry for them, but I understood that these were the natural consequences of their actions. In a small town where everyone knows each other, reputation is an important asset that is easy to lose and difficult to restore. A week after Oliver's arrival, Hugh called me. "Mom, we found an apartment. It's not great, but it's livable. It's in the city center near the ferry terminal." "I'm glad," I said sincerely. "When are you moving?" "This weekend. Oliver is helping with the packing. He's very upset about all this." "I know," I sighed. "I talked to him. He's a strong boy. He'll get through this." "Mom," Hugh's voice trembled. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry about what happened, about those words. I shouldn't have—" "Don't, Hugh," I interrupted him gently. "What's done is done. Maybe someday we can repair our relationship. But right now, we all need time and space." After that conversation, I sat by the window for a long time, looking out at the bay. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of gold and pink. Fishing boats were returning to the harbor after a day's work, reminding me of the days when Hank used to go out to sea on his Seawolf. Life went on. My new life, in which there was no room for resentment or regret, only hope for the future. I didn't know what the next few years would bring, but for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. In the evening, Phyllis called. "B, come see me when you have a minute. I want to show you something." I went down to the store where Phyllis was arranging new books on the counter. "Look," she said, handing me a glossy magazine. "There's an article about small coastal houses on North Cape. One of them is for sale. I think it might be right for you." I took the magazine and saw a photo of a charming white house with blue shutters standing on a cliff above the sea. Small, cozy, with a terrace overlooking the bay. "It's beautiful," I admitted. "How much is it?" 200,000. Within your budget, especially after setting up the trust fund for Oliver." I thoughtfully leafed through the pages of the magazine. The cottage on North Point was a 15-minute drive from downtown Ketchikan, close enough to maintain ties to the city, but far enough away to avoid constantly running into Hugh and Imogen. "I'll think about it," I said, returning the magazine to Phyllis. "Thanks for showing me." "You're welcome," she smiled. "You know, Bee, I'm proud of you. Not every woman your age would dare to make such a change." Did I have a choice? I shrugged. Sometimes life pushes us toward change. You just have to go with the flow. When I returned to my apartment, I found a small package on the doorstep. Inside was a polished wooden box, the one Hank had brought me from his last voyage. I thought it had been lost during the move, but now it was back with me. Attached to the box was a note. "Grandma, I found this among the things my parents were going to throw away. I thought it was important to you. Love, Oliver." I opened the box. Inside were old photographs, letters from Hank, and the wedding ring I had stopped wearing after his death. Memories of the past that will always be a part of me, but no longer define my present and future. It's been 6 months since I started my new life. The cottage on North Cape that Phyllis showed me turned out to be exactly what I dreamed of. Small, cozy, with a terrace overlooking the bay. I bought it for $195,000, slightly below the asking price, thanks to my negotiating skills, which I had not lost during my years as an accountant. Every morning I woke up to the cries of seagulls and the sound of the surf. Sitting on the terrace with a cup of coffee, I watched the fishing boats go out to sea and remembered Hank. Now those memories didn't cause me pain, just a warm sadness and gratitude for the years we spent together. 3 days a week, I worked at Phyllis's bookstore. I enjoyed interacting with customers, recommending books, and organizing small literary evenings. In my spare time, I knitted for a local charity that provided warm clothes to the homeless and needy. And on Wednesdays, I continued to meet with the Silver Needlers at the community center. My life was filled with new acquaintances and experiences. I signed up for computer literacy courses, learned how to use email and video calls, which allowed me to communicate regularly with Oliver, who was studying on the other side of the country. I even started a social media page where I shared photos of my knitting projects and received orders from people all over Alaska. Hugh and I rarely communicated, only when necessary, mostly about Oliver. Our conversations were polite but cold. The wound inflicted by his words had healed, but the scar remained. I didn't hold a grudge, but I couldn't forget. I learned about Hugh and Imogen's life mainly from town gossip. Ketchikan is a small town where news travels fast. I knew they were renting an apartment downtown, that Imogen had never gotten a promotion at the cruise line, and that Hugh was spending more time fishing, alone, without his wife. One day in April, when spring was already in full swing, reviving even the harsh Alaskan wilderness, I was working at Phyllis's store. It was a quiet day with few customers, and I was arranging new books on the shelves when the bell above the door rang. I turned and saw Dorothy Bishop, one of the members of our craft circle. She was excited and clearly in a hurry to share the news. "Beatrice!" she exclaimed as soon as she crossed the threshold. "Have you heard?" "Heard what, Dorothy?" I smiled, accustomed to her emotionality. "About your son and his wife." She lowered her voice, even though there was no one else in the shop but us. "They're getting divorced." I froze with the book in my hand. The news was unexpected, though perhaps not so surprising given the circumstances. "How do you know?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "My niece works in the court," Dorothy announced proudly. "Hugh filed yesterday. She wasn't supposed to tell me, of course, but you understand." I nodded, understanding. In Ketchikan, professional ethics often gave way to family ties and long-standing friendships. "They say they're having financial problems," Dorothy continued. "After selling the house, Imogen insisted on buying a new home, but they didn't have enough money. They took out a loan, then couldn't pay it back. And then Imogen didn't get the promotion she was counting on. The argument started, the mutual accusations." I listened silently, not knowing how to react. On the one hand, I felt sorry for Hugh. After all, he was my only son. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a kind of just retribution. "Beatrice?" Dorothy looked at me intently. "Are you okay?" "Yes, of course," I said, returning to arranging the books. "It's just that the news is unexpected." "You didn't know?" She looked disappointed. "I thought Hugh told you." "No," I shook my head. "We haven't been in touch much lately." Dorothy nodded understandingly, then bought a new detective novel and left, no doubt to share the news with her other friends. In the evening, when I returned to my cottage on the Cape, I sat on the terrace for a long time, thinking about what I had heard. My feelings were complex and contradictory. I didn't wish my son any harm, but I couldn't help seeing a certain pattern in what had happened. Imogen, with her ambitions and desire for status, couldn't cope with the financial difficulties and loss of reputation in the town. The next day, Oliver called. We usually talked once a week, usually on Sundays, so the call on Wednesday was unexpected. "Grandma?" His voice sounded tired and tense. "Have you heard about my parents?" "Yes, dear," I replied softly. "I found out yesterday." "Dad called me last night," Oliver said. He's in a terrible state. He says everything is falling apart. I was silent, not knowing what to say. I felt sorry for Hugh, but I couldn't help remembering how he had told me to get out of the house. I'm coming home for the weekend, Oliver continued. I want to support him, and see you, of course. Can I stop by? Of course, dear, I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. I'm always happy to see you. How are things at college? We talked a little more about his studies, new friends, and projects. Oliver was excelling in his marine biology research and had even been invited on a summer expedition to the Arctic coast. I was proud of my grandson and glad that the trust fund I had set up allowed him to focus entirely on his studies without worrying about finances. On Saturday morning, I baked a blueberry pie, Oliver's favorite dessert, and tidied up the guest room. My house was small, but it had 2 bedrooms, so my grandson could stay with me without feeling cramped or making me feel cramped. Oliver arrived after lunch, tired from the trip, but with a happy smile when he saw me. We hugged at the door, and I could feel how much he had grown up in the last 6 months. He was stronger and more confident. Grandma, you have a wonderful house, he exclaimed, looking around. And the view is amazing. Yes, I was lucky to find it, I nodded, leading him to the kitchen where the table was already set with tea and pie. Sit down and tell me how you're doing. How's Dad? Oliver frowned. Not very well. He blames himself for everything, the divorce and the financial problems. He says it all started the day Oliver hesitated. When he told me to get out of the house? I finished for him gently. Yes. He looked at me guiltily. Grandma, I have to apologize for them, for how they treated you. It was wrong. Oliver? I covered his hand with mine. You don't have to apologize for your parents. You had nothing to do with it. But I should have noticed what was going on. He shook his head. I should have done something. You were in college, focused on your studies. Besides, it was an adult relationship between adults. Don't take on responsibility that isn't yours. We talked for a long time about what had happened, about his feelings and experiences. Oliver was caught between 2 fires, his love for his father and his respect for me. I tried to convince him that he didn't have to choose sides, that he could love us both despite our conflict. What about Mom? I asked when the conversation turned to more practical matters. What does she plan to do? She's moving to Seattle, Oliver replied. She's been offered a job at the cruise line's headquarters. Not a promotion, but a chance to start over. I nodded. For Imogen, it was probably the best option, to leave Ketchikan, where everyone knew our family's history and where her reputation was hopelessly tarnished. What about Dad? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. He's staying here. He says he can't leave Alaska. His whole life is here, his roots. Oliver paused, then added, He'd like to make things right with you, Grandma. Not right away, of course, but eventually. He's very sorry about what happened. I thought about it. Forgive Hugh? Maybe someday. But forget? Never. Time will tell, Oliver, I finally said. It's too early to talk about that now. That evening, we sat on the terrace, admiring the sunset over the bay. The sky was ablaze with shades of orange and pink reflected in the calm water. You know, Grandma, Oliver said suddenly, you look happier than before, more free. I smiled, surprised by his observation. That's right. I'm finally living my own life, making my own decisions. It's liberating. I'm happy for you. He squeezed my hand. You deserve to be happy. We were silent, watching the last rays of the sun disappear over the horizon. Then Oliver said, Grandma, I want to thank you for the trust fund, for your support, for everything. You have no idea how important that is to me. You're my grandson, Oliver, I replied simply. And I love you. I'll always love you no matter what happens. The next day, Oliver left, promising to come back again during the summer holidays. I stood at the door, waving goodbye, and thought about how my life had changed over the past year. Named from a humiliated mother-in-law, suffering neglect in her own home, to a free woman living her own life, respected in society. I went back into the house and walked to the window, looking out at the bay. Fishing boats were returning from their morning catch. Seagulls circled above the water, searching for prey. Life in Ketchikan went on as usual. That evening, Phyllis called, B, have you heard? Hugh and Imogen are getting divorced. Yes, Oliver told me, I replied. He came to visit over the weekend. And how do you feel about that? My friend asked cautiously. I thought about it. How did I feel about my son's divorce? With regret, of course. No one wants their child to go through such difficulties. But at the same time, I couldn't help but see a kind of justice in it. I'm sorry it turned out this way, I finally said. But I can't say I'm surprised. Their marriage was always based more on ambition than love. And you? How are you feeling? Phyllis asked. I looked around at my cozy little house, at the books on the shelves, at the unfinished sweater for Oliver's summer expedition, at the photos of me with my new friends from the craft club, with the members of the book club that Phyllis and I had recently started. You know, I said slowly, for the first time in a long time, I feel like myself. Not someone's mother, wife, or mother-in-law, just myself, Beatrice Knightley, a woman who has finally found independence and respect. And it's a wonderful feeling. We talked a little more about plans for the week, new books for the store, and the upcoming craft fair where I was going to showcase my work. The usual everyday topics that now made up the fabric of my life. After our conversation, I went out onto the terrace wrapped in a warm blanket. Evenings in Alaska were still cool even in April. A full moon hung over the bay, reflecting in the water like a silvery path. I looked at this landscape and thought about the strange twists and turns of fate. Who would have thought that at 73 I would start a new life? That I would find the strength to stand up to injustice, even if it came from my own son? That I would find new friends, new interests, a new home? I didn't know what lay ahead. Perhaps someday Hugh and I would rebuild our relationship, not as it was before, but at least with respect. Perhaps I would see Oliver graduate from college, start a career, and start a family. Perhaps I would live many more years in this little house on the Cape, watching the seasons change over the bay. But whatever happens, I knew one thing. I would never again let anyone take away my self-respect and dignity. It was a lesson that came late, but fortunately, not too late.